So I'm not quite sure if I have the best uppercut, but if anyone wants to fight me in the alley after, I'm happy to do so, because I'm going to tell you right now, I have the best dad in the world. So you actually probably know him. He often bikes, walks, or runs on the W&OD, wearing a bandana, tank top to show off his sweet tats, and has headphones in. He's either listening to Cheap Trick, Taylor Swift, Ed Sheeran, or Harry Styles. And honestly, it depends on his mood. So 2 years ago, my parents, my brother, and my fiance, obviously the coolest one, and I went up to Massachusetts to visit our extended family for Thanksgiving. After a few days of a lot of food, which included Portuguese dressing, French dressing, turkey, meat pies, all of the things, we decided we needed to take an adventure. So my dad grabbed my fiance and I in the car and said we were going to do a tour of where my parents grew up. My parents grew up 20 minutes from each other. They actually went to the same high school. My mom was 2 years older, cougar, and they met over 10 years later on a blind date. They have been married for 32 years, and my dad proposed after 10 weeks. So my dad drove us to Fall River, Massachusetts, which is on the southeast coast, and we drove by my Meme and Pepe's house where my mom grew up, went up the street, turned the corner to my parents' first house together. Could you imagine living that close to your in-laws? And then we drove to my dad's favorite grinder shop to grab a snack, and then we headed on over to Westport, Massachusetts. Where I was driving down the road, I prepared myself, because as we turned on the street where my dad grew up, there was a family who collected clown memorabilia and had it all in their yard. Terrifying. We turned the corner and pulled up in front of my grandparents' former home. My grandfather passed away over 15 years ago, and we haven't been in the home since. As with any family, sometimes there's issues. And unfortunately, after my poppy's passing, we don't speak to my dad's side of the family anymore. So we hadn't been in the home since his funeral. We sat in the car for a while, and I could tell my dad really wanted to go in. We couldn't be those creepy people just going into someone's house. So instead, we went to Mrs. B's house, and she lived across the street. Mrs. B was, I think she's in her late 90s, so there's a 50-50 chance she was going to answer the door. She might be dead or sleeping. She answered the door and immediately recognized my dad and was so excited we had stopped by. We sat on her couch, and she had a photo of my brother and I from our 2003 Christmas card still on her TV stand. She clearly loved us very much. After saying goodbye to Mrs. B, we headed back to the car. And at that very moment, a woman stepped out on the front porch of my dad's childhood home to light a cigarette. My fiance and I got in the car, it was cold, and I could tell my dad wanted to go in. And he said, I'm just gonna ask her a couple questions. So he went up to her, and after a few minutes of smiles and lots of hand gestures, he came over to the car and said, get out, we're going in, she's calling Bob. Bob was the second owner of the home, since my grandmother had sold it over 15 years ago. And from the outside, it looked virtually untouched. Well, when you opened the door, it was also virtually untouched. It was like jumping into a time machine. Wood-paneled walls, the kitchen still had avocado green appliances, but Bob did have a kick-ass big TV in the living room, so we admired that for a few minutes. My dad asked this girlfriend if we could take a look downstairs. Downstairs was my poppy's workshop. My dad often worked down there with him on projects. The second she opened the door, the smell hit me immediately, and I was transported back to being 12 years old, visiting their home. As we walked down the stairs, these same duck curtains were hanging on the door, and it was still painted the same shade of blue. My dad headed immediately to the back, where my poppy's workshop was. He had built amazing benches and all things for his trinkets, and Bob had taken advantage of this as well, as he was a tinker himself. I could tell my dad was looking for something. I wasn't sure what. He's looking around, and he turns to the corner, and there's this piece of plywood hanging on hinges, kind of looking pretty random. But he turns the door over, and on the back are heights of my dad from when he was a kid, and my brother and I and other members of my dad's family, still written on this door. My dad immediately started crying, and if you've ever seen your dad cry, you know you also cannot help but cry. As we're crying, looking at this piece of my poppy that was still in this home, probably 40 years later, we couldn't help but feel a sense of closure that we had a piece of him still alive with us. As my dad and I are crying, my fiance and this woman don't look like they know what to quite do. And Bob finally comes home. He comes down the stairs and gives us a hug. Never had met this guy. And he said to my dad, "That door has been there since I bought the home, and I knew someone was going to come back for that someday. I knew in my heart that they were going to come back, so I never took it down." Bob didn't know what it meant to us, but I think when he saw my dad's face, he understood. He went to go grab his screwdriver so we could take the door off the hinges and take it back with us to Virginia. As we headed back upstairs, my dad had one more question for Bob. Had he happened upon a vintage beer can collection in the ceiling of the garage? I'm not sure if it was a collection or more of a hiding space, but Bob had assured us that he had not found a collection, but why don't we come in the garage anyways? Bob had retrofitted the garage to be his car shop. He loved cars. You know what? My poppy did too. So the fact that Bob was still working on cars in this garage was amazing, and he was fascinated by all of the outlets and plugs that were everywhere. My poppy was an electrical engineer and knew his way around a socket. As we were bidding adieu to Bob, we exchanged phone numbers so we could show him where we ended up putting this door in my parents' home. And then we looked at the car we were in, which is a 4-door sedan, and we weren't quite sure how we were going to fit this in there. But we did, and we drove it back to the hotel, but we knew we needed another way to get it back home to Virginia. So as my fiance and dad are debating what to do, they're about to get in the car to go to Home Depot and use one of the saws that are there. And at that very moment, a maintenance worker from the hotel happened to walk by with a handsaw in his hand and asked if we needed help. Thank you.